All right, let's dive right into this explainer. We're going to explore how the absolutely crushing socio-political climate of 19th century Russia forged one of history's greatest literary minds. We're talking about Fyodor Dostoevsky. And trust me, his actual life was just as dramatic, tragic, and complex as any of the incredible characters he came up with. I mean, think about it. How exactly does a mock execution create a literary genius? It's a pretty shocking question, right? But to really get Dostoevsky, we have to look straight at the immense suffering that acted as the crucible for his art. He didn't just sit in a cozy study dreaming things up. His worldview was literally forged in poverty, radical politics, imprisonment, and some incredibly deep psychological trauma. So, here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with his childhood in the crucible, then look at the bureaucratic trap of his era. After that, the mock execution in exile, followed by Russia's failed emancipation. Then we'll cover his subsequent suffering and redemption, and wrap up with his lasting literary legacy. Basically, we're going to trace the big picture history of Imperial Russia right alongside the micro history of Dostoevsky's life, just to see exactly how trauma gave birth to his masterpieces.
Section 1. Childhood in the Crucible.
Okay, picture this. It's Moscow, 1821. Dostoevsky was not born into some sheltered, idyllic, noble life like a lot of writers back then. No, he was born at the Mariinsky Hospital for the Poor, which is where his father worked as a military surgeon. And this hospital was right in the middle of one of the absolute worst areas of Moscow. We're talking surrounded by a cemetery for criminals, a lunatic asylum, and an orphanage. So while other kids were highly protected, Dostoevsky's literal backyard was a hospital for the destitute. He had a front-row seat to the struggles of the outcasts from day one. He'd even sneak out, despite his incredibly strict, authoritarian father, just to sit in the hospital gardens and listen to the sick patients tell their stories. Growing up in that environment with such a volatile father ingrained this deeply tormented compassion in young Fyodor. Section 2. The bureaucratic track. Now, to really grasp his early writing, you have to understand the unbelievably rigid society he was living in. Way back in 1722, Peter the Great introduced something called the Table of Ranks to organize the military and civil service. And it completely defined your worth as a human being. The titular counselor was the 9th rank, and for so many people, it became the symbol of absolute bureaucratic stagnation. You see, if you could just hit the 8th rank, you got hereditary nobility, meaning your kids would inherit your high status. But the state kept changing the rules to make jumping from rank 9 to rank 8 practically impossible. It was a total trap. On paper, the title of counselor offered this amazing illusion. It sounded highly prestigious, right? And it did grant personal nobility to you. But the reality? It was a dead-end clerical nightmare. Because you couldn't pass that nobility down to your kids, men would spend decades literally just copying papers, trapped in poverty, desperately trying to get that one promotion. It bred so much intense resentment and honestly, literal madness. It perfectly explains the massive psychological tension in Dostoevsky's early novels, like The Double, where these eternal titular counselors literally lose their minds trying to escape their social cages. Section 3. Mock execution and exile. This right here is the absolute pivot point of his entire life. It's where personal tragedy collides violently with the ruthless power of the Tsarist state. So in 1837, his mother dies of tuberculosis. Just 2 years later, his authoritarian father dies. And it was widely believed in this deeply haunted Fyodor that his father was murdered by his own serfs. The rumor was they forced him to drink vodka until he drowned as revenge for his cruelty. Fast forward to 1849. Dostoevsky, now young writer, gets arrested for hanging out with a radical socialist intellectual group called the Petrushevsky Circle. The Tsar's secret police actually sentenced him to death. They marched him and his friends outside in the freezing cold, tied them to posts, and made them wait for a firing squad. And then, at the very last possible second, a messenger rides up and commutes the sentence. It was a mock execution. It was purely designed for psychological torture. Standing there in the freezing weather, fully believing he had seconds left to live, well, it fundamentally shattered him and completely rebuilt his entire worldview. So instead of being shot, he was sentenced to 4 years of brutal, hard labor in a Siberian prison camp. Stripped of his freedom, his identity, everything. He was packed into a filthy, freezing barracks with actual murderers and hardened criminals. He literally described it as being shut up in a coffin. But something really profound happened in that darkness. He completely abandoned the utopian, radical socialist ideals he had in his youth. Through all that intense suffering and armed with literally nothing but a New Testament, he underwent this massive, profound conversion to Orthodox Christianity. He came to believe that true, lasting change
couldn't just be legislated through political revolution, it required the spiritual redemption of the individual human soul.
Section 4. Russia's failed emancipation.
Now, while Dostoevsky was away in exile, Russian society was allegedly going through this massive reform. In 1861, the Tsar abolished serfdom. Huge deal, right? Well, actually, this emancipation was kind of a devastating illusion. Just look at the land distribution. The wealthy landlords retained 67% of the land, and of course, they kept the very best parts for themselves. The newly freed serfs, they only got 33%, which was usually the worst, least arable leftover scraps of land.
And it gets worse. The peasants didn't just get that 33% handed to them for free. No way. They were forced into 100% mortgages to buy it, saddled with lifelong redemption payments that were so crippling they had to be passed down to their children. And to make absolutely sure they paid up, the state tied them to the mir, which was the village commune, basically preventing them from ever moving freely. So instead of genuine liberty, the peasants were hit with a total bureaucratic nightmare. This failed reform fueled the exact social tensions, the extreme poverty, and the deep, deep societal resentments that we see bubbling over into violence and despair in Dostoevsky's greatest novels.
Section 5. Suffering and Redemption.
So Dostoevsky finally returns from a decade of exile and military service. He steps back into a society completely on edge, and he's battling some really severe personal demons of his own. In 1864, he's absolutely devastated by the death of his first wife, and then almost immediately after, his beloved older brother Mikhail dies too. Suddenly, he's carrying the massive financial burden of his brother's family on top of his own, and he sinks into a really deep depression. Trying to win his way out of debt, he develops a severe compulsive gambling addiction, racking up even more massive debts at roulette tables across Europe. It is genuinely astonishing to realize that some of the greatest psychological novels in human history, books like Crime and Punishment and The Gambler, were written in an absolute mad panic, just to satisfy ruthless creditors and publishers who were threatening to seize the copyrights to literally everything he'd ever written. But through this incredible crucible of debt and grief, his core philosophy really solidified. He became this fierce, vocal critic of the growing movements of Western nihilism, rational egoism, and socialism that were sweeping through the Russian youth at the time. He neutrally observed these radical shifts happening all around him and channeled them straight into his writing. And the brilliant thing is, he didn't just write cheap propaganda. He presented what's called a polyphonic clash of ideologies. He actually gave his ideological opponents the strongest possible arguments in his books. But ultimately, he used those stories to show that trying to organize society purely on logic and reason without God inevitably leads to destruction. He argued that true spiritual regeneration could only ever be achieved through the acceptance of suffering.
Section 6. A lasting literary legacy.
So how did all of this incredible trauma actually manifest on the page? Well, rather than just being normal, everyday people, his characters are more like living, breathing ideas. You have the humble, self-effacing Christians who just bear the weight of the world's suffering. You've got the chilling, self-destructive nihilists who truly believe in nothing. Then there are the cynical, sensual debauchers who honestly sound a lot like his own father. And of course, the rebellious, proud intellectuals whose theories literally lead them to commit murder. Because of his own intense life experiences, Dostoevsky was able to push these character types to their absolute psychological extremes, throwing them into these explosive, feverish conflicts driven entirely by the crucible of their environment. I want to leave you with this final thought. There's a quote from John 12:24 that serves as the epigraph to his masterpiece, The Brothers Karamazov, and it's also engraved right there on Dostoevsky's tombstone. Except a corn of wheat fall into the ground and die, it abideth alone. But if it die, it bringeth forth much fruit. It leaves us with a really profound, lingering question to think about. Could Dostoevsky's unparalleled literary fruit, those deep psychological insights that literally shaped modern literature, could they have ever existed without the agonizing death of his early innocence in that Russian crucible?